The Battle off Samar became one of the last large-scale sea battles of the Pacific Theater before Japan lost all of its mighty naval power. The encounter took place on October 2, 1944, east of Samar Island, when the Japanese Navy attempted to counter the American forces during the Battle of Leyte Gulf to prevent the liberation of the Philippines. After successfully luring several U.S. Navy task groups into a trap, a Japanese fleet of 23 warships that included the largest battleship ever built ambushed Taffy 3, a minuscule U.S. force unit of fewer than 13 ships. It was one epic last stand in which the Americans prevailed against all odds. Preparing for battle. After almost 3 years of fighting in the Pacific, Japanese air and sea supremacy was in full decline. Allied forces steadily approached mainland Japan, and the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army sought new ways to fight a technologically and economically superior enemy. Fortifying islands from amphibious assaults was one such strategy, but that did not change the increasing American dominance. Japan then started deploying larger fleets to survive against overwhelming odds, as their crippled economy could not afford to lose more ships and aircraft without a purpose. This forced Japanese commanders to constitute the combined fleet to conduct naval operations. On October 17, 1944, Operation King II was launched to liberate the Philippines. American, Australian, and Philippine forces landed off the coast of Leyte Island under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, while Leyte's native population of almost 1 million people also cooperated. Meanwhile, the Japanese Imperial Navy's first mobile fleet launched Operation Show to confront the American forces off Leyte Island in one decisive encounter. The plan called for Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa and his Northern Force fleet to lure the United States Third Fleet away. If the maneuver was successful, the Allied landing forces would be vulnerable by air and sea. The opportunity would then be seized by Vice Admirals Takeo Kurita and Shoji Nishimura. Both men would strike the remaining Americans at Leyte by sending their center and southern forces to destroy the enemy ships and ground troops. Falling into a trap. At midnight on October 23rd, U.S. submarines Darter and Dace detected Vice Admiral Kurita's center force as it passed through the Palawan Passage. The Battle of the Shibuyan Sea would ensue. Kurita's center force consisted of several destroyers, cruisers, and the colossal super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the heaviest and most powerful warships ever built at that point. After receiving approval to engage with the enemy, the 2 U.S. Navy submarines launched the torpedoes and sank 2 Japanese cruisers. One of them was the 71,000-ton Musashi, which was finished off as the submarines received assistance from a squadron of 30 Grumman Hellcats and several Curtiss Helldiver bombers that carried 500-pound bombs. Kurita and 600 crew members were rescued by the destroyer Shimakaze, and the Vice Admiral was quickly transferred to the Yamato to continue leading his force and head westward. An hour later, Nishimura's southern force was also attacked but suffered minor damage. Nevertheless, they later came up against the American 7th Fleet Support Force and were completely destroyed in what would be known as the Battle of Surigao Strait. Although the southern force was decimated and the Musashi was destroyed, the Americans were inadvertently falling into a trap. Admiral Halsey and 3 groups from Task Force 38 were lured into the battle off Cape Engano to face Ozawa's northern force. Halsey brought 600 aircraft, 5 aircraft carriers, 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 45 destroyers. Meanwhile, the northern force comprised only 3 light carriers with 100 aircraft, 2 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. It was a sacrificial diversion to move most of Halsey's fleet away, and it worked. As Halsey moved towards Japan's trap, Vice Admiral Kurita gave orders to commence their maneuver. He had feinted his withdrawal aboard the Yamato, but the ship turned around while the center force headed through the San Bernardino Strait in the middle of the night. The Japanese vessels were undetected and faced only scattered light Taffy task groups of escort carriers from the American 7th Fleet. The rest of the ships were miles away, engaged at Leyte Island. David versus Goliath. The Japanese attack would mostly fall on the northernmost of the carrier units, Task Unit 7743, under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The task unit was usually referred to by its call sign, Taffy 3. The unit was not equipped to fight large-gunned warships. It consisted of 3 destroyers, 6 small escort carriers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Meanwhile, Kurita's forces comprised the gigantic Yamato and his 18-inch guns, 4 battleships, 11 destroyers, 6 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers. The scenario quickly became a David versus Goliath situation. When Clifton was notified about the mighty Japanese naval formation by friendly reconnaissance aircraft, he knew that a fierce collision was inevitable. One shot from the Yamato was more than enough to destroy any of the ships from Taffy 3, and the most potent weapons the Americans had were Mark 12 5-inch guns mounted on the destroyers. By 6:50 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Kurita made visual contact with Taffy 3. The Japanese center force immediately got in formation and closed in at 30 knots. Minutes later, the Yamato fired some salvos, and the near misses blew up towering walls of water near some of the American vessels. Taffy's destroyers responded by throwing smoke screens to conceal their retreat to Leyte Island and prevent the Japanese from firing accurate shots. Meanwhile, the few pilots from the American carriers readied for a desperate attack, while the task force zigzagged through turbulent waters and gigantic splashes. Aboard the USS Johnston destroyer, Captain Ernest E. Evans realized that it was a matter of time before the Japanese would begin picking off American vessels as if they were sitting ducks. Not willing to let the Japanese reach Leyte Island and destroy his task group without a fight, Evans ordered his crew to prepare for a furious charge against Kurita's 23-warship center force. A legendary clash. Without warning, the 15,000-ton Fletcher-class USS Johnston destroyer broke out of the smokescreen and sailed straight into one of the most powerful fleets ever assembled. Evan wanted to buy the rest of the Taffy 3 unit enough time to reach Leyte Island safely. The Johnston then began zigzagging and firing with all of its might at any enemy within its range. Avenger and Hellcat fighters flew over the Johnston to drop ordnance with perilous strafing runs in a sky full of smoke and explosions from more than 500 anti-aircraft guns. When the destroyer miraculously got within the range of the Japanese Kumano heavy cruiser, 7 times its weight, Evans gave the order to fire against it with all their 5-inch guns. Within minutes, 200 rounds destroyed the cruiser's superstructure and some of its heavy gun mounts. The Johnston then launched a barrage of 10 torpedoes that broke the Kumano's hull, splitting it in 2. Evans spent all of his ship's heavy payload in this confrontation, so he commanded to turn back at full speed while firing all the remaining ammunition at enemy vessels. The destroyer was then hit in the boiler by 16-inch shells, halting its speed by half. Another hit ignited the anti-aircraft ammunition magazine and blew several decks, while a last impact damaged its bridge and destroyed the radar. Still, the battered and heavily damaged Johnston was a sight to behold against the Japanese warships piled up on the horizon. Captain Evans lost 2 fingers and suffered shrapnel damage in the face. But like a force of nature, he stood up and continued shouting orders at his crew. Right before USS Johnston was sent to the ocean depths, the destroyers Hirman and Hull and the escort Samuel Roberts came through and joined the suicidal fight. The American destroyers quickly charged into combat and passed by the burning Johnston. Evans and his crew then turned back once more for a courageous last stand, along with their fellow brothers. The rest of Taffy 3's unit, including the vessels Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, also joined the fray, while the few standing American aircraft continued their strafing runs, knocking every gun they could with their machine guns. At 8:30 a.m., USS Hull's crew abandoned ship. 10 minutes later, USS Gambier Bay began sinking, but its crew was rescued. With all of their torpedoes gone, the American destroyers kept zigzagging and firing all the remaining salvos, At 8:50 a.m., USS Samuel B. Roberts was critically hit, and by 9:45 a.m., the Johnston was attacked by the light cruiser Yahagi and other destroyers. Captain Evans quickly abandoned ship with his crew, and then the unthinkable happened. The Japanese center force started to withdraw. Withdrawal. As the Americans were able to sink 3 Japanese cruisers and disable another 3, Vice Admiral Kurita believed more reinforcements were coming and called off the attack. Taffy 3 ultimately suffered over 800 losses and 750 wounded with 4 sunk vessels. Similarly, the Japanese lost over 500 lives. The Battle off Samar ultimately led to an astonishing American victory that pitted an underpowered task force of 13 modest ships against a Japanese formation of 23 warships. It also marked the final defeat of the Japanese Navy, and its ships remained at port for most of the remaining war. Captain Evans was never seen again after he abandoned the Johnston and boarded a raft. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, whose citation read, quote, "His valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will venture as an inspiration to all who served with him." Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Seas channel for more exciting content on historical sea battles, and hit the bell icon to receive notifications on our newest content.